Hi, everybody. Today we're going to talk about what happened after 1945, post-World War II. We're going to look at abstract expressionism and post-painterly abstraction. So here's the world, a map of the world in 1945. I just like to flip back and forth between this and a map of the world in 2000. As you can see, there is extraordinary change among country borders, and a lot has changed since 1945. So, World War II and its aftermath, we're going to be looking at the shift of Western art from the center of Paris. Remember, we were mainly talking about the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists and Cubism and all of the stuff that was happening in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century has now shifted from Paris to New York as a result of world events. Most of the war took place in Europe, so a lot of artists fled to the United States. We're also going to see that art is becoming more multicultural, and also there's more acceptance of art forms beyond the Western canon. We're going to see different art styles. It's not in this presentation, but we're going to see that it's not just painting. There's all kinds of medium and ideas are going to start popping up, and yeah. So also we're going to recall leading artists and the respective styles and or media with which they're associated. Okay, so many artists like Philip Guston and Louise Nevelson, Stuart Davis, and abstract expressionists, including Lee Krasner and American painter Jackson Pollock, they all worked for the WPA's Federal Arts Project, which we talked about in the last presentation, which was a component of Federal One. So, for example, Jackson Pollock worked as a mural assistant and later as an easel painter between 1938 and 1942. And then after World War I, Pollock became a major figure in the abstract expressionist movement, which we're going to talk about today. So, also, in addition to Pollock, the WPA employed a number of other abstract and experimental artists that would go on to form the New York School, which is an avant-garde art movement of the 1950s and 60s, and that group included artists such as Mark Rothko and Willem de Kooning, who we're going to talk about today. Okay, I'm sure you're familiar with Francis Bacon. This is titled Painting from 1946. He incorporated a lot of gory images here. There's some sort of slaughtered animal that's hanging in this space with this man who's looking also really scary under some sort of umbrella. But then the floor, if you look at the carpet, it's giving us, it like reminds me of a casino in Vegas. They actually make carpets all these different colors in case people drop their casino chips. They don't want to make it easy for them to find it. Apparently, they make a lot of money just by dropped casino chips on the floor. And that's what it's sort of reminding me of. But this is, a painting in the aftermath of World War II. And, it's this figure that's sort of presiding over the slaughter, could be the reflection of the butchery of war. This is Alberto Giacometti, Man Pointing. I'm sure you've seen his sculptures as well. This is made of bronze from 1947. We get the feeling of this alienated figure. He's solitary and sort of lost in the world's immensity. He's, severely attenuated, which means to be sort of stretched out, thin. Writer John Paul Sartre considered Giacometti's thin, virtually featureless sculpted figures as the epitome of existentialist humanity. Okay, so let's talk about abstract expressionism. It was one of the first major avant-garde styles to be developed in the United States. There were two main processes, abstract expressionism. Of abstract expressionism, there's the gestural abstraction and then the chromatic abstraction. Pollock and de Kooning are generally considered gestural abstraction painters, like action painters, and then Newman and Rothko are recognized as chromatic abstraction painters. So what were they trying to express through their artwork? Let's talk about that. So the aim for today is, what is abstract expressionism? Who were the major players? Who or what were their influences? Why did they paint like this? Where were they located? And how did they paint? So we just talked about that they're mainly located in New York City. And yeah, let's talk about the other questions. So abstract expressionism. In post-war modernism, it was strict formalism. So what do we mean by formalism? We talked about this a lot at the beginning of the year. It's basically an emphasis on an artwork's visual elements rather than its subject. So, we're really just explore, rejecting illusionism and explore the medium. That was sort of the quote that they went by. And yeah, so like whenever we look at a painting or an artwork, we should say, and we don't know anything about it, we can always formally analyze it, right? So we're looking at the elements and principles of design. How did the artist set up the composition? What colors did they use? What are the brushstrokes like? You can formally analyze any artwork and know nothing about it. So with abstract expressionism, this is what they were really focusing on. They were focusing on the formal elements of art and less about the subject or the context. So like I said earlier, there were two general movements. The gestural abstraction, like we see in the top two up here, we have Jackson Pollock, and then we have Willem de Kooning, who we're going to talk about today. And then chromatic abstraction, like Barnett Newman and Mark Rothko, who were colored field painters. I'm sure everybody knows Jackson Pollock. This painting's in Washington, D.C., but the MoMA has a giant painting much like this. It's called Lavender Mist. The original title was Lavender Mist, and he changed the title to number 1. It's from 1950. Part of the reason he changed the title is because he didn't want anybody to have any, Lavender Mist, we start thinking about flowers and a landscape, and that was the exact opposite of what he was trying to do. It was just purely lines and brushstrokes and action. So here's an image of Jackson Pollock painting in his studio in Long Island, and from 1950. And we call this gestural abstraction because, as you can see, he's like really making the gesture with his whole body, actually. Apparently, he would lay these canvases out on the floor and he would just pour paint and he would fling paint. He used all kinds of things like sticks and old brushes, knives, trowels. He poured paint and sand and glass, and apparently he would be like smoking cigarettes and there's cigarette butts in it. And, he would sort of like use his whole body to paint some of these paintings. This is Dubuffet, and again, you can see this is definitely a gestural abstraction painting, abstract expressionist painting. And here he used this like very thick impasto paint, and then incised images. You can see images that have been incised into the paint. And yeah, what does this remind you of? It does remind me like a little bit of cave painting in some ways. So I think, they're also like kind of trying to go back to this state where, painting was, it was like more about the act of painting. So, it sort of gives us this impression of crumbling walls or like worn pavement. So here is your number 145, Willem de Kooning's Woman 1. And from 1950 to 1952, he worked on her for a very long time. Obviously, it doesn't look like that. I mean, a lot of people would look at this and be like, oh, a child could do that, blah, blah, blah. But like Picasso, he had skills to render figures realistically, but he chose not to. He scraped off the paint of this and repainted and scraped and repainted like 200 times for this painting, to the point where apparently the canvas was even getting kind of weakened because it had been, used so much. Um, and this is abstract expressionist, but he's also revisiting the theme of the female figure with the title, and we also see a figure that's in this painting. He is referencing the Madonna, but like in Christian iconography, but also he's referencing pinup girls. And if you look at the teeth of this figure, she's sort of like a smiley poster girl. I know it seems like a stretch, but I'm going to show you a picture. The time period, we have, GIs coming back from war, and women were being shown on the silver screen. And, this is kind of about what the traditional figure means in an art world that has turned towards abstraction. So Willem de Kooning was so much about the process. Like I said, it was all about pushing paint around the canvas. He was using the figure as inspiration, but he was really just wanting to experiment, getting, different paint on the canvas. So this is one of a series with 6 women as the theme. This is number 1. There are 5 others. We can see really thick and thin black lines that dominate the painting and essentially unify it. He often merged abstraction and representation, this is a great example of that. Yeah, and in 1953, the Museum of Modern Art acquired a new painting, one that promoted its collection committee to state, quote, "The committee found the picture quite frightening, but felt it had an intense vitality and liked the quality of the color." So, end quote. With this painting came obviously accusations of misogyny, because viewers perceived his portrayal of its female subject to be frightening, objectifying, and violent. For de Kooning, however, this was a continuation of his earlier explorations of the human figure, and like I said, an opportunity to push paint around the canvas. I think this is a quote from the Khan Academy, and it says, "From a Paleolithic fertility goddess to 1950s pinup girl, her threatening gaze and ferocious grin are heightened by de Kooning's aggressive brushwork and intensely colored palette." Like I said, he painted this like over 200 times, and you can see that this was done in the span of 2 years. It would be really cool to see a progress shot of it. I would love to see the different versions that this was. So like I said, he's referencing the Madonna and Child. He's referencing the female figure. Here, just a little refresher. We have here the Virgin and Child between Saints Theodore and George from the 6th or early 7th centuries, encaustic on wood. Here we have Chambou's Madonna and Child from the early Renaissance. And then we have Manet's Olympia. So here's an up close version. So as we can see, look at her face. You can see why people thought that he was being a little misogynistic. Particularly, let's look at the face and the smile. Like we said, he was sort of referencing 1950s pinup girls. And de Kooning, like Francis Bacon, also drew from found photography and that were often torn from magazines. Here we can see, he was fascinated by the image of alluring lips in cigarette advertisements. Yes, back in the day, they used to advertise cigarettes, which is seems so far away because obviously they don't do that anymore. Anyway, he incorporated collages of this T-zone, and in this small painting of a woman from 1950, and also in several early states of Woman 1, which we're looking at. So you can see this giant smile. You can definitely see the what he's referencing here. We could also go back and review some other ways that the figure has been portrayed throughout history. This is Tlateco female figure from central Mexico from around 1200, 900 BCE, made of ceramic. And, like when we think of abnormalities, like a lot of times in today's culture, we look at them in a negative way and we try to fix them like through surgery or, whatever. But uh, back in the day, they were actually considered to be like shamanistic or like supernatural, and they considered them like very sacred. So here also we have the same figure next to the Venus of Willendorf from Paleolithic culture. Um, and we also see the Venus of Holfels, one of the oldest representations of figure that's been found, from 40,000 to 55,000 BCE. You can see that Willem de Kooning is definitely referencing some of these figures as well. All right, and then also the running horned woman from Algeria and pigment on rock. More than 15,000 drawings were found at this site, and this is composite view with the front side version with the horns facing frontal. This was wet grasslands, now is desert. But at the time, they think that the dots could have represented body paint, and this could have been some sort of cloud with rain coming down. Maybe it could have, been some sort of, this is prehistoric, so I don't really know, but it could have been referencing some kind of agricultural dance. Okay, and then we have Marcel Duchamp from 1919, and this is obviously the Mona Lisa that Marcel Duchamp has appropriated, and then he put these letters LHOOQ at the bottom, which, if pronounced in French, sound like LHO au cou, which in French means she is hot in the arse, and which is obviously a vulgar expression implying that a woman has sexual restlessness. So this is clearly during the Dada period. And here we have, again, Willem de Kooning. This is a photograph of him on the right in his studio with you can see some of his drawings in the background next to his woman one. So moving on, so we would call him definitely a gestural abstractionist from the abstract expressionist movement. And Helen Frankenthaler, your number 149, also would be considered an abstract expressionist, but not so much an action painter as maybe color field painter. But just like with many other abstract expressionist paintings of the 1950s and 60s, it's really important not to get caught up in the possibility of subjects or context or biography, and just focus on what we see. So the physical elements of the work, because it's those elements that can tell us so much about the painting. This kind of painting is often classified as color field painting, and painting characterized by simplicity of line and a focus on color as the subject. The first generation of abstract expressionists like Mark Rothko and Barnett Newman were the first important color field painters, and Helen Frankenthaler is usually considered to be like a second generation member of this group. Here's an image of her on the right, her in her studio working. She's pouring. She kind of invented this soak stain technique. And on the left, we have her in her studio sitting on top of her paintings with her paintings. She's surrounded by her paintings. This is the cover of Life magazine. And so by the time she painted The Bay, your number 149, she was already a well-regarded artist. She had been the subject of this Life magazine profile in 1956 and was one of the handful of women among the traditional all-boys club of the New York abstract expressionists. Her approach here was to use the soak stain method with diluted acrylic paint. So why do you think that she invented why did she use this like innovative method? She used it because, she felt like acrylics gave her more flexibility with viscosity and movement than oils did, and allowed her more control as she poured that thinned paint onto this taut, unprimed canvas so that it would get absorbed into the weave of the fabric. So, as a substitute for the action of the brush, Frankenthaler would lift the canvas and tilt it at various angles so that the paint would flow across the surface. She had to account for gravity and the ebb and flow of the liquid across the flat surface. So, a fascinating aspect of Frankenthaler's method is the blend of the artist's control paired with the unpredictability of the forces of nature. So this is interesting too. The Bay was chosen as one of the paintings for the American Pavilion of the 1966 Venice Biennale. I showed you some pictures of the Venice Biennale. It's close to my heart because I studied my graduate degree program was through NYU, but I studied 2 summers in Venice, and the Venice Biennale happens every 2 years. So I do try to go back to the Venice Biennale whenever it's up. It's on the odd years, so it's not there this summer, but I did get to see it last summer. And her painting, which was it's a huge honor. Basically, the during the Venice Biennale, each country gets to choose one, or the United States chooses one artist and to be featured in the American Pavilion. And in 1966, Helen Frankenthaler was chosen because of this painting. So you can see here that the shades of blue that run into one another are part of the specific process of pouring paint onto the canvas. Um, so, rather than painting the colors onto the surface with a brush, like, leading abstract expressionist painters like Jackson Pollock or Willem de Kooning or Franz Klein were so famous for doing, she chose to do this pouring, which actually stained the canvas. She called it the soak stain method. And yeah, just to reiterate that she felt like this gave her more flexibility, and she liked the way that it soaked into the canvas, into the weave of the fabric. So here we see her in the middle, but I'm sorry, the middle and the top. And then we see Jackson Pollock, who's like flinging his paint that sort of sits on top of the canvas. So Frankenthaler definitely was inspired by this drip method of Jackson Pollock, who began painting on the floor in the late 1940s. But she knew that she wanted to work differently. And so Pollock and other artists such as de Kooning and Franz Klein had made this painted gesture really famous and recognizable by the early 1950s. Here's another Helen Frankenthaler painting called Mountains and Sea from 1952, and it's charcoal and oil on canvas. In 1952, at the age of 23, Frankenthaler's experiments led her to produce her first major painting, Mountains and Sea, this expansive, luminous depiction of the landscape of Nova Scotia, where she had recently taken a holiday. So Mountains and Sea, in turn, inspired other painters to use the soak stain method to great success, painters like Kenneth Nolan and Morris Louis. And this, it created, the sense of natural spontaneity and devotion to color is part of what makes the Bay and the work of the color field painter so compelling. The basic formal elements of a painting speak for themselves as the viewer experiences the work in a fundamental, direct manner. Here is another color field painter, Barnett Newman, and his is obviously very different, right? It's so much more rigid, but he really sought to create art that was, spiritual and sublime. So this painting is, in Latin, means man, heroic, and sublime. It's 18 feet long and 8 feet high. He creates these lines. Looks like there's maybe five or six lines in this painting. He calls them zips, and he made them because he wanted to sort of create a square in some cases. So, I'm pretty sure that the line, he did not paint the line. The lines are underneath, and then he painted the red paint over it. So the cadmium red is in smooth layers so that no brushstrokes are visible. It's meant to be seen up close and overwhelm the senses. Critics who saw this painting were unmoved, rejecting it as impersonal, something that a house painter could do rather than an artist. And then, I'm sure you're familiar with Mark Rothko's work. He has such an interesting story. If you get the chance, you should research his life and his story. It's very interesting. He paints these very large color field paintings so that one could be quote unquote in the painting. So, those viewers who broke down and wept before his paintings, he stated, had the same religious experience I had when I painted them. Okay, so post-painterly abstraction was a broad term created by Clement Greenberg in 1964 that encompasses a variety of styles that evolved in reaction to the painterly gestural approaches to some abstract expressionists. So we're going to see hard edge abstraction and color and more color filled painting. So Clement Greenberg was probably the single most influential art critic in the 20th century, and he was really closely associated with his support for the abstract expressionists, in particular Jackson Pollock, but his views closely shaped the work of many other artists, including Helen Frankenthaler, Morris Louis, and Kenneth Nolan. His attention to the formal properties of art, color, line, space, and so forth, really was his approach to his criticism. And he's really, really important in 20th century modern art, and he influenced generations of critics and historians and artists. So, just like we've seen with a lot of other art movements that keep kind of going back and forth between artwork that is very like loose and gestural, goes back and forth between that and like rigid, very rules-oriented art. So, like, for example, we see that with neoclassic art. It's like very, there's not supposed to be any brushstrokes, and it's very realistic, and you're supposed to have these big themes. It's very rule-oriented, and then that is sort of placed between Rococo, which is kind of frivolous and very light, and Romanticism, which is also very painterly. So here again, we see the abstract expressionists who are very painterly, and then moving from that to hard edge abstraction. So this is from 1963, Ellsworth Kelly, red, blue, and green. This is hard edge painting. There's no depth. It's like I said, this is Frank Stella. This is a good example of Greenberg's purity in art, and the viewer must acknowledge that a painting is simply pigment on a flat surface. So it is, in the same way, it has the same idea as abstract expressionists, in that they're just purely looking at formal qualities. However, they are also kind of rejecting the abstract expressionists and making it ultra rigid and hard edge. And then this is also color field painting, Morris Louis, who's clearly inspired by Frankenthaler and Pollock. Okay, and then I'm going to throw in minimalism before I give you the question. Art, and I just, think about, like, to you, do you think like minimalism and post-painterly abstraction, are they valid forms of art? I don't expect you to answer that right now, but so many times I have so many students who are like, that's not art, miss, I can do that, blah, blah, blah. But we have to really look at the whole history of art and think about, like, where it's coming from and how it fits into the context of what's going on in society and what's going on in the art world. And so obviously, it is valid art forms of art. It's just, this is what was going on. So minimalism, we think of objects and nothing more. Okay, so the beginnings around 1960s, it was a reaction to abstract expressionism. So they wanted to reduce the art. So we see Lee Krasner here, her painting, abstract expressionist painting, Night Creatures, and then Donald Judd, his Untitled from 1969. Obviously, formally very different, right? Okay, their philosophy was to eliminate emotions, illusions, and meanings, create a single object, move away from illusions and alternate perceptions, experience reality more directly. And some of these artists are Frank Stella, Donald Judd, Carl Andre, Sol LeWitt, Robert Morris, and Dan Flavin. So Frank Stella was one of the first minimalists with his black paintings, which we're going to just briefly talk about. His quote is, "My painting is based on the fact that only what can be seen is there. It really is an object. You can see the whole without confusion. What you see is what you see." Here's some more of his paintings. You can see clearly he was like hard edge painter for a lot of his work. But what he's very much known for are his black paintings, which did have texture in it. I think you can see it a little bit better in this painting as he's painting it here. You see that he does leave the, I don't know if this is a gessoed canvas or raw canvas, but you can see that he is creating a pattern, but he's painting it. He's not using, like, in this case, he's not using tape. When you look at it close up, you can see that it has a hand, like it's been hand painted. So, but here, is his series of black paintings that he's, considering them like objects. Okay, Tony Smith, this is, it's a sculpture called Die, and it's steel. It's 6 feet by 6 feet by 6 feet. It's at the Museum of Modern Art. And this sculpture, Die, is a reflection of Smith's intimate, lifelong relationship with industrial materials. And other than the title, what are some other symbols of death? I know it's like so funny. It's like just a giant steel cube, right? But we're starting to get into conceptualism here, right? So it's called Die. So other than the title, what are some other symbols of death? So Smith has taken the symbolic relationship between death and the measurement of 6 feet, the traditional depth at which to be buried. So, we think about 6 feet under, people are buried 6 feet under, and this is what he's referencing. Donald Judd, Untitled, he's using brass and colored fluorescent plexiglass on steel brackets. Again, this is a great example of minimalism. Okay, so real quick, I'm just going to show you my credits, and then I'm going to go to the question. So please answer this question in Google Classroom. This is a question that is going to be like on your AP exam in a few weeks, and it's addressing the continuity and change question. So like we said before, think about tradition or conventions, and think about innovations and change. Okay, so first I want you to describe at least 2 visual characteristics of Helen Frankenthaler's painting The Bay. And then I want you to accurately use specific visual evidence to explain how The Bay demonstrates established traditions or conventions in abstract painting. So how is this the same as the traditional abstract painting conventions? Then I want you to, number 3 here, we're moving down, number 3, using specific visual evidence, explain how The Bay demonstrates changes from established traditions in abstract painting. What was the innovation she used? So explain that using specific evidence. And then finally, using specific contextual evidence, explain why Helen Frankenthaler deviated from established traditions in her abstract painting. Okay, feel free to pause it, do whatever you need to do to answer this question, in your Google Classroom. Okay, take care, you guys. Miss you. Bye.